Welcome to another Pogchamps 3 recap. We're looking at the match of Michelle Khare against Logic. Let's jump straight in. So in the first game, Michelle Khare started with the white pieces, and we have d4, d5, and now bishop to f4, the London system. And against the London system, black chose bishop to f5, and you have to be very careful when taking out your bishop symmetrical to how white took it out, because what happens is that usually there's this idea of queen to b3, because often you play c3 or sometimes c4, and immediately you apply pressure onto this weak pawn. So you should, keep that in mind, that this could backfire because this pawn is no longer defended, but for the most part, it's a developing move, so nothing really wrong there. We have bishop to d3, and I think that a6 is not a great move. I think it was probably stopping the pin. If he moved the knight out to c6, maybe he was worried about the pin, but if he knows the London system, he knew that, he would have known that usually you put your bishop on d3, you don't pin any piece that comes here, and usually your bishop here is just a very strong piece. The bishop drops back to g6, which I think is a very cool move. If you take the bishop now, h takes, and the rook immediately gets active, so I think this is something you can apply to your games, especially in the London system, or openings when there's usually this standoff of bishops, because this could also happen if the other bishop came here. You always have the ability to drop the bishop back and look to open up your file. So here the bishop drops back. We have c4, which is a very strong move, just striking in the center. I think c3 is a bit more typical to the London system, but I don't think there's anything majorly wrong with c4. It also makes room for the knight to come to c3. But you have to move the knight to c3. If you move the knight to d2, you blunder your bishop. So there's a very common mistake that some people make. When this bishop is undefended, the queen is the only defender, and usually you move your knight here and your other knight here. So sometimes people still move their knight here, but you have to develop it here because, again, otherwise you lose your bishop, unless you want to develop it to the side of the board, but you never really want to do that. So the game continues with e6. We have the knight coming to f3, both players developing, white castles, and now bishop to h5. And bishop h5 is a very interesting move. You're pinning the knight, and although right now that doesn't really mean anything, later black might be able to apply more pressure onto the knight. And also it means that if you ever move your queen, they can take your knight and possibly wreck your structure. And so one option is to move the bishop back here, get out of the pin, add another defender, and so now if you ever move your queen, for example, b3, which is a common idea again in the London, if they take the knight, you can take like this, and your king is perfectly safe. And so that's one option, but moving a bishop back is not something you want to do. You've already developed this bishop, you want to start attacking, you've got your king safe, you've castled, you've developed your pieces, let's go ahead and start pushing. So you don't really want to kind of make a move backwards, although it's a good move, but that's kind of the mindset of Michelle Khare probably. She didn't want to move the bishop back, and so she moved the queen to b3. And I don't think that this structure is necessarily horrible for white. You can use it to your advantage too. You can move your king here, you can put your rook on this g file, and use this open file to your advantage, but I do think that bishop to e2 should have maybe been considered a bit more heavily, and in general, retreating moves are not always bad moves. I mean, sometimes it's just necessary to retreat, because this is just such a powerful threat. Of course, again, the structure, it's not the biggest deal, but if you don't want to ruin your structure, you should retreat here. It's not always a bad move to retreat. But the queen comes to b3. Now Logic just takes the knight, and here you should just take, because after you take, this queen is still very powerful here, applying pressure onto this pawn, threatening to take this pawn, so this queen is still a monster here. You should not immediately go and use this queen and take the pawn once they take. And this is a very instructive mistake, because Michelle Khare did do this. If your opponent counterattacks, right, this is a very nice attacking move. The queen here is very powerful. It applies pressure on the center, on this pawn. So if you're going for an attack and your opponent does something on the other side of the board, maybe they take a piece, you shouldn't immediately just continue with your attack. You have time to respond, because if your attack is so powerful, then after this, they still have to do something that they might not really want to do. For example, here they might have to take, and maybe they can ignore this pawn, but maybe, for example, rook to b8, which isn't a great move. And so they will still have to do some sort of response. So you don't always have to immediately capture or immediately go for your attack once they do something. If they do a counter attack on the other side of the board, you have time here to just capture. But Michelle Khare, she wanted to take. Now it might seem like this move is fine because you're attacking the knight and at the same time attacking the bishop. So if the bishop moves, you win the knight. However, there's a very sneaky move, knight to a5. And you're attacking the queen. And so if you move the queen, they can move the bishop to safety. However, it's actually very tricky here because there's no great move for the queen. Every square is covered other than this pawn. And here it still might seem like everything's fine because after takes, the knight is attacked and the bishop. So if they move one of them, you take the other. However, here, black is not going to take because this knight is actually defended through this queen. And so in this position, black simply won't take, and they will just move the bishop back. Maybe they'll take here first, but eventually they'll move the bishop to safety, and everything will be okay for black. So it's a very tricky position, but tactically it doesn't work here for white, unfortunately. Logic decided to first take the pawn here, and then after white took, then playing this move, with the bishop still being attacked, and now the queen's attacked. And here, unfortunately for Michelle Khare, she did not find the only saving, well, not saving because you're still losing, but the only good move here, which is taking the pawn, which is the only safe move for the queen. So she didn't find any safe moves, and so she just sacrificed the queen for the most she could. But of course, this is just completely losing now. In this position, there's a tricky idea. There's g5 maybe. If the bishop takes, you can just move your bishop away, and if white is not careful, the bishop here is getting taken by black. If they play h4, you can go for h6, winning the bishop. So it's a tricky idea. It's a little trap that Logic could have set, but instead he moves the bishop back, infiltrates with the queen, and then pushes this pawn very nicely, just three times, setting up this very unstoppable checkmate, and he checkmates on the next move. So the game ends with, the first game ends with Logic winning. Let's move on to game 2. In the second game, Logic started with the white pieces. We have e4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to c4. A very common mistake. And notice that white played just the exact same moves as you would against e5, right? So against e5, you put your knight here, they usually put their knight here, and then you bring out your bishop. But you have to adapt depending on what they do, because in the Sicilian, although you're not blundering anything, when you put your bishop here, very temporarily does it have this long diagonal because they have the ability to play e6. In the other line, the pawn was already on e5 and pawns can't go backward, so this bishop had a very long diagonal, a more permanent long diagonal. Whereas here, e6 and your bishop is immediately shut out, and this is just not very good for you. So this is exactly what happened in the game. Here we have d3 and now g6, a very weird setup that Michelle Khare chose, because what happens is that you have all of your pawns here on light squares, and so all of these darker squares in this side of the board are very, very weak. And of course you're going to have a bishop trying to control them, but notice that in the future, if this bishop ever gets traded, that could lead to a lot of attacking possibilities for white. So the game continued with knight to c3, the bishop coming to g7, we have the bishop to d2, and now knight to f6. And now a3, I've seen that Logic does this a lot in his games, just pushing these pawns. Maybe here he was thinking that after this move he has another square for the bishop, but I think you shouldn't really worry about this too much unless they're threatening to trap your bishop, right? So unless this is necessary, focus on castling here, right? You can castle, you can develop, you can try other things, but this is just such a waste of a move. I don't think it's worth it. In the game, he did end up using the square for the bishop, so maybe here it did pay out. But he could have also gone here in that game. So I don't know if I would say that a3 was worth it. Now black castles, white castles, we have b6 and queen to c1. This is a really cool move because although the queen here doesn't really do much, I think the idea itself is good, which is moving your bishop to h6 and trading it for this bishop. Because like I mentioned, these dark squares can become very weak potentially. And so, for example, if black does nothing, here takes, your queen is infiltrating, eventually you can move a knight, maybe push a pawn, maybe, push this pawn, get the rook in eventually, and you're going to be able to just have a permanent queen here and they can't really kick it out because they don't have enough control on the dark squares. And so that's kind of what he was going for. However, in the actual game, what ended up happening was bishop developing to b7, and after this, she doesn't take. And I think that knight jumping to g4, it does blunder a pawn here, but the idea itself is good. You want white to take, and then take back with the king so the queen does not infiltrate. If you take here, after takes, this king can't, it can't come here. This queen is going to be here basically forever. You can't ever kick it out, at least not, very successfully. And so it would have been better for black if instead you forced white to take, because now the queen is no longer infiltrating. So the move knight to g4, the idea, I think, was to try to tempt white into taking, which is exactly what happened. However, it didn't really work out so well because the knight no longer defends this pawn, so white simply took the pawn in the center of the board. Logic is playing very well right now. And here, the queen took the knight, blundering the fact that there's a bishop. And, already Michelle Khare is down a lot of material. But, the game is never over. Here we have the knight coming to h5, the queen jumping to c7. This is looking very good for Logic, and he's playing this very well. He's getting his rook in. He wants to attack this king, and of course, he's completely fine with trading. Obviously, if you're up material, trading is good. So the rook comes to e6. He takes the free knight. Of course, the rook no longer defends the knight. The knight comes to f4, and we finally see this. We don't see the trade anymore because the knight no longer defends the rook. So a couple of big blunders here, but I don't think it would have made much of a difference because, of course, you're down so much material already. The knight comes to h5. The knight comes now to e5. And although it might seem scary, there's no real threat here. Of course, this pawn is defended. So here, black could simply take the pawn here and then try to sweep up these pawns. And although you are down a lot in material, maybe you have a chance. But I don't really see this turning that well for black because, of course, white can do a very similar thing here, sweeping these pawns. So in this position, actually, though, Michelle Khare ran out of time, so the game ended right here. Let me know down below who you want to win this whole Pogchamps. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.